If you remember the pictures that we saw from that period of mourning in China, what we're seeing here in Myanmar is basically exactly the opposite of that. Today at 9 o'clock local time here, the flags were lowered to half-mast on a couple of government buildings in many cities around Myanmar, but that was basically it. There was no central ceremony, there was no moment of silence, and really, when you go across this country through the towns, then you really don't get the impression that this is a society in mourning. Many people that we've talked to say they didn't even know anything about this until they read it in the newspapers this morning. There was actually a government decree that was printed in the newspapers ordering this 3-day period of mourning, and certainly many people in this country are wondering why this period of mourning was called in 18 days after the cyclone has hit, why this didn't happen any earlier. But it is certainly one thing that we're seeing is that the government here does seem to be making more of an effort to go out into the open, to start something like a public relations offensive, it almost seems like. We saw the leading general Tan Shui on Myanmar TV only yesterday touring some of the refugee camps, making it seem as though the international relief effort and, of course, the Myanmar government relief effort is really reaching those most badly in need of help. But certainly that is something very different than what we've been seeing.
This rice field was farmer U Han Yun's livelihood. Normally, he would be preparing to plant the next crop right now. But since the cyclone hit, the soil is useless. No rice will grow here for a very long time, he says. The soil is dead because of the floodwater that the storm brought. Like so many villages in the most devastated area, this one subsists from rice farming. The Irrawaddy Delta is known as Myanmar's Rice Bowl region, feeding the entire country and leaving enough to export to neighboring nations. But when Cyclone Nargis ripped through here more than 2 weeks ago, much of the production was destroyed. And that destruction is long-term. As we take a boat trip down the rivers of the Irrawaddy Delta, along with the massive human death toll, we also see water buffalo carcasses everywhere. Buffalo are the main farming animals here, and without them, the people can't plow their fields. Less than a month from now, the villagers were going to plant their next crops, but their seeds were also ruined by the storm. We are trying to dry the seeds in the sun, this farmer says, but it's hopeless. Once the seeds have started sprouting like this, we can't plant them anymore. All we can do is feed them to the animals. The cyclone itself only claimed 3 lives in this village, but now the farmers say they fear the worst. We are all going to die here, he says, but not because of the cyclone. We will die because we have no food. Starving to death as they stand on what was some of the most fertile land in Myanmar.
Right now, the UN's top disaster official is in Myanmar. Monday will mark John Holmes' first full day in country. He's there trying to convince military leaders to please let in more international aid. The UN is now estimating about 2 million people are suffering from a lack of food and a lack of clean water. And it's now been more than 2 weeks since Cyclone Nargis hit the country, particularly really devastated the Irrawaddy Delta. The UN is pushing for a huge, massive international aid effort, but right now Myanmar's military junta is only letting in a sporadic number of aid workers, still only letting in a sporadic amount of supplies. There are people on the ground saying that the supplies are in a bottleneck right now, sitting sometimes at the airport for days, unable to get to the areas that are hardest hit. And that is what many leaders of other countries are complaining about, saying that a massive aid effort needs to be pushed right now, immediately, to keep the people of Myanmar safe. Right now, you've got many, many people who are literally living with absolutely nothing and unable to get aid at all. This is a real issue. International aid agencies are sitting here in Bangkok hoping to send in thousands of aid workers, but until Myanmar gives them the go-ahead, they are just sitting here waiting. Meantime, there are millions of people in need of help. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Bangkok. I don't think it is easing. This is a good example. You're mentioning UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Right now, the UN's top disaster official is in Myanmar. John Holmes is there. and is planning to spend a few days there trying to convince the Myanmar military leaders to let the massive aid effort in. The UN says now about 2 million people are suffering from a lack of food and water, and that has gone on for more than 2 weeks now since Cyclone Nargis hit the country. And that is a great source of frustration. Obviously, not having food and water for that long can be disastrous for those people who are living in Myanmar. The UN visit is pretty significant because it really illustrates the high level of pressure that is being put on Myanmar's military junta. We should mention there have been some developments. The senior general Tan Shui, normally reclusive, very secretive, was outside in public at one of the relief camps near Yangon, touring the area, and there are pictures of him going around and meeting and greeting victims. But obviously that area that he was in was not the hardest hit. It's the Irrawaddy Delta that is the most damaged part of the country, and the part of the country that really isn't seeing the kind of aid, the number of aid workers that it needs to see. In the meantime, though, Myanmar's military junta has allowed in more aid, little by little. There were 30 doctors, for example, from Thailand who went into the country. But when you're talking about this massive scale, these massive numbers of people who are suffering, who don't have what they need to survive, 30 doctors is, like putting a Band-Aid on a massive bleed. This is really not enough, and that's what the international community has been saying for days now. Really, the frustrations are still there, Hugh. There are lots of people just waiting to go in, including members of the UN, and there are lots of other issues as far as getting the aid to where it needs to go. There are observers saying that a lot of the aid that has been dropped off at Yangon Airport is just simply sitting there waiting to be distributed, and many people are saying the only way that that can be distributed to those who need it most in the Irrawaddy Delta is with boats, and there just aren't enough. So these are the kinds of issues that will be talked about. There were some protests about this, about the aid not being let in the numbers that it needs to be let into the country outside of Myanmar in the north here in Thailand. People are still frustrated, and yes, while there are little things happening, while the military is giving way little by little, it just isn't enough, and it's not fast enough. And as each day goes by, international aid workers are saying more and more people are in danger of dying. Disease, not having enough drinking water, it is really still quite a mess.